Hello, everybody. So now that we have a bit of space from the initial tumult around last weekend's events in Charlottesville, I think it's worth taking some time to consider the free speech issues that were raised by that event in a little more detail, get into the legal dimensions of what transpired and what it portends for free speech more broadly, and how this episode fits into the pantheon of free speech, legal precedent, and so forth. So, to preface, I first want to say that I really think it's worth stressing that the ACLU of Virginia has done just an exemplary job in holding fast to its principles, not wavering even in the face of the attacks that have come its way fast and furious since last weekend, when a lot of people apparently regarded the ACLU of Virginia as the main perpetrators of the violence that unfolded, or at least the main enablers of it, simply because they chose to represent the organizers of the White Nationalist March in court and contest the city officials' intent to withdraw the permit that the White Nationalists had obtained through all the normal channels. And I think it's worth getting into the specifics of what the ACLU actually did, because a lot of people, I think, have a misperception about what the ACLU had endeavored to do. Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, who was pretty intimately involved, it seems, in actually coordinating some of the law enforcement response, McAuliffe declared a state of emergency at some point, or was involved in the declaration of the state of emergency at some point on Saturday. So McAuliffe, in the aftermath of this event, attacked the ACLU of Virginia and said he was incredibly angry about how the ACLU had represented these clients, and that the ACLU was to blame for the violence that unfolded. Now, notice that Terry McAuliffe, despite effectively being the commander-in-chief of the Virginia State Police and having domain over other law enforcement officials in the state, doesn't self-criticize, doesn't look at the police as perhaps being culpable in what transpired. He goes out of his way to lavish praise on police and reserve his ire for the ACLU. And all the ACLU did, at core, was ensure that the white nationalists who they're representing were treated equitably under the law. Now, to ensure that white nationalists are treated equitably under the law is in no way to endorse the substance of what white nationalists are actually trying to promote. On the total contrary, you can fully and explicitly and steadfastly reject the white nationalist rhetoric and their message and their program as repugnant, which the ACLU, basically as an institution does, while still wanting to ensure that their rights are adequately protected under the law, because everyone benefits from an equitability of treatment under the law, whether that be marginalized minorities, whether it be socialists, whether it be all manner of left-wing activists. You want people to be treated equitably under the law and not have the content of their speech or the substance of their political views dictate how state officials would treat them in terms of issuance of permits or allowing of various rallies and other public political demonstrations. So that's what the ACLU did. And they argued in court that the city of Charlottesville had failed to make a case that the revocation of the permit that had been issued to the white nationalists was warranted. Now, the judge sided with the ACLU. The federal judge sided with the ACLU because, basically at the 11th hour, prior to the white nationalists holding their rally, the city decided just all of a sudden to revoke the permit that, again, had been issued some time before. Now, in order to revoke a permit, the city is obligated legally to present evidence that there is some compelling public interest to thwart the ralliers' speech rights and revoke the permit, but the city did not do that. The city actually issued more than one permit. They issued permits as well to counter-protesters, and according to the city's own estimates, the counter-protesters were likely to attract even greater numbers of attendees than the white nationalists, which they, by all accounts, did. There were more counter-protesters than white nationalists, it seems. So if the city is going to argue that the number of people coming to attend the white nationalist rally poses a safety threat, then they would have to explain why the counter-protesters permit wouldn't be revoked on the same grounds. And the city didn't explain that, and the ACLU pointed out that the city didn't explain that, and the judge agreed with the ACLU that the city had failed to make a case for why the revocation of the permit was warranted. Now, you might say to yourself, well, I don't care if these Nazis or white nationalists or otherwise repellent people get their permits revoked. They deserve it. They're terrible people. They shouldn't be allowed to go in public and make their odious views known. Well, you have to ask yourself, what if state authorities applied that same logic to a group that you are more in sympathy with? So you could well imagine a government official or group of government officials getting together and issuing a permit to Palestine Liberation Group, maybe to, thinking back a couple years ago, to an Occupy Wall Street group. Somebody could argue on the part of the government that those people getting together poses a safety threat, and use that as a pretext to basically cancel the rally. If you're going to enshrine the precedent that canceling the white nationalist rally would entrench, then that could just as easily be used against groups you maybe are more aligned with. And that's the key aspect of this. It's not an endorsement of the white nationalists' rhetoric or of them personally by any stretch of the imagination. It's saying that in order to protect the underlying principle, you need to come to the defense, in a legal sense, of the most despicable people who, notwithstanding their being despicable, have the same rights under the law as even people you might have agreement with. And that's something that also is worth emphasizing. Oftentimes, the principles which undergird many of our legal philosophies are best illustrated when you can point to the most despicable example. So let me rephrase that. Very often, examples of people who are despicable getting equal protection under the law are the most instructive and the most forceful in actually enshrining the underlying principle of that law. So if you insist that the same protection should be afforded to white nationalists, then you're actually strengthening the principle that anybody, irrespective of political views, ought to be granted a permit if they comply with the correct protocols, and cannot be denied permits to hold rallies on the basis of their speech. And that's what the ACLU did here. And I think they should be commended for it. Now, McAuliffe, the governor, has been on a rampage against the ACLU. And he seems to think that basically denying groups permits on the basis of speech, of the content of their speech, is a legitimate function of government. Apparently he has no awareness that in doing that, basically you allow for any group to be discriminated against on the basis of their speech. And this led me to think of, as I mentioned before, the Occupy Wall Street movement. It was extremely common for Occupy-aligned groups to be stymied by government officials on pretextual grounds, meaning government officials, usually municipal officials of one kind or another, would invoke phony public safety arguments or public health arguments to justify why they would revoke a permit or why they would close off a certain gathering area that Occupy demonstrators had utilized. And frequently the ACLU would be coming to the defense of those Occupy protesters and saying, no, you are in essence discriminating against this group on the basis of the content of their speech, or you are not permitting you are not adequately allowing for the expression, the constitutionally protected expression of speech on the part of these groups. And the reason why the ACLU can come to the defense of those people is because they have an arsenal of legal precedent at their disposal, which allows them to cite various legal case law, to cite various precedent in terms of earlier decided decisions, and say you are obligated under the American constitutional framework to abide by these free speech dictates and allow these people to demonstrate. And now, hopefully, they have an additional tool in their arsenal to ensure those rights as a result of their advocacy on behalf of the white nationalists. You know, it's been dispiriting to me because I've personally been a supporter of the ACLU for basically as long as I can remember, going back to when I was a teenager. You know, during the George W. Bush era, when the ACLU were kind of the lone protectors, it seemed, of various civil liberties, and for the ACLU now to be demonized by people who otherwise would probably be in political accord with them, I don't know, maybe it speaks to some troubling trends in American political discourse. To me, it just underscores that advocating for free speech is kind of a indefinite endeavor. You have to constantly be making the case for why it's an imperative, or else people are going to lose sight of it, especially when they see these despicable people being protected by free speech law. But again, I keep thinking back to the Occupy movement of 2011, 2012, when you'd have situations like, for example, and I mentioned this in my Medium post, which I go through all these points, so I'll link to that in the description box. Please read that. But thinking back to an instance in Seattle where there were there was a group of sort of loosely Occupy affiliated homeless advocates who were kept getting their permit to congregate in a park unduly hindered due to the city's refusal to abide by First Amendment protections, and the ACLU came to their defense. That's an example of a more sympathetic group being afforded the legal protections that we want to be applied across the board, or at least ought to want to be applied across the board. And again, I just want to emphasize, because I see some people mentioning this in the comments, which I kind of look at out of the corner of my eye. But it's a little annoying because I frankly lose concentration. This is not to draw any equivalence on a moral level between white nationalists / Nazis / racists / whatever and the Occupy movement or the pro-Palestine movement or whatever. Obviously, if you're situating those groups on a moral plane, the Nazis or the white nationalists or whatever the term is are going to be on one extreme end, and a Palestine Liberation Organization is going to be situated on another end. So I'm not making an equivalence there, and I think people really need to get that drilled into their heads. The only sense in which they are equivalent is that they are entitled to equivalent treatment under the law to express their views. That is a foundation of American constitutional law and liberty. And I think liberty is indispensable to any kind of vibrant intellectual movement. And the idea that people are willing to just cast it aside and downplay its importance, I think it's a very bad omen. It seems that, in all candor, on the left, there is a growing strain of illiberalism, in the sense that there is a growing belief that individual liberty is no longer a priority, that free speech protection can just be withdrawn on a whim if you dislike somebody enough, and that kind of mindset can boomerang and harm the left just as much as it might harm whoever your current enemies are. And to me, that's a truism of history. Read through the history of the ACLU and the people that they've come to defend over the years. Overwhelmingly, it's people like, recently it's Muslim groups who get unfair treatment under the law and have their their speech rights stifled. Going back further, it's socialists and communists and atheists and people who are looked at generally unfavorably by the wider public, but nonetheless have a clear-cut right to have their be able to legally voice their opinions and express speech in the public square. So that is my little homage to the ACLU, and it's been a little flustering, to say the least, to be accused of quote-unquote defending Nazis by dint of defending the ACLU's position, which is its long-standing position, which has been applied to innumerable other contexts. If the ACLU comes to the defense of somebody who has declared their affinity for ISIS, doesn't mean that the ACLU is endorsing ISIS or defending ISIS. It means that they want equitable treatment under the law because they view that as fundamental to a free society. So I would just encourage people to not get bogged down in this bad faith criticism that by saying that the ACLU or anybody else who defends the rights of even repulsive people are correct to do that. You're inevitably, judging from my own experience of the past couple of days, you're inevitably going to get deluged with criticisms about how you are somehow in league with Nazis, and it's just a lie. It's a grotesque lie, and it should be countered stridently until people get the message. So that'll do it for now. Please read the Medium piece. I will link to that in the description box, and have a great night.